What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Season 4 of The Last Kingdom, which dropped on Netflix yesterday. The show is based on the giant 12-book saga, The Saxon Stories by author Bernard Cornwell, and I should admit, I've been intending to read at least some of this series for a very long time, even bought some of the books, but sadly, I am completely, totally ignorant of the books because I tend to lean toward like medieval fantasy stories as opposed to historical fiction. That said, ever since I first started watching this show about a year ago, I've been completely, totally addicted. I think this is one of those legitimate, total sleeper hits on Netflix that appears to be slowly but surely gathering a massive fan base. And as far as I'm concerned, they can continue to make this show indefinitely, and I will always come back. And with 12 books out there, I don't know how many of them have been adapted so far, but obviously there's plenty of material to work with. And I know a lot of people talk about how this is one of those shows that can scratch your itch if you're missing Game of Thrones. But for me, that doesn't quite work because Game of Thrones obviously takes place in a fictional setting. It has dragons, it has magic, whereas Last Kingdom, this is pure, unbridled historical fiction at its best. Or maybe I'm overstating the case by saying at its best, because the show certainly has an abundance of flaws, but if you fall in love with the show, the flaws become almost part of the show's charm over time. But some of these flaws might be deal breakers for some people, but I look at this show almost like this giant medieval political soap opera with the occasional burst of savagery with these large-scale battles. And like any good soap opera, you have people forming alliances, becoming enemies, falling in and out of love. And it seems like almost every single episode of all 4 seasons, you'll see Uhtred either becoming the greatest warrior that the Saxons have ever seen, or he's banished, or he becomes an outcast, or he's a prisoner. And the fact that he's always drifting in and out in terms of how popular he is with the Saxons is once again part of the show's charm. Now, I should also admit ahead of time that I'm going to mess up pretty much every single name in the show. I've got them all written down, but my knowledge of old Anglo-Saxon pronunciation is non-existent. I will do my best to be consistent when it comes to the name of the locations, but no matter how many times I've heard Uhtred say that he's Uhtred of Bebbanburg, I know I'm getting the pronunciation of that name completely fouled up. But speaking of Bebbanburg, that is a huge part of the plot early in this season where we finally see Uhtred turning his eyes to Northumbria and trying to reclaim his birthright, his homeland. And like every season before it, this season of The Last Kingdom gives us an entirely new status quo, as well as some major changes along the way throughout the season, which eventually leads to this really cool open-ended Season 4 finale that I thoroughly enjoyed, making me cross my fingers that Season 5 will be forthcoming in the near future. But in terms of the overall structure of Season 4, it basically was divided into 2 parts, leading to 2 huge massive battles. The first against Canute, or Canute, however you're supposed to pronounce his name, and then with the second major battle against a new kind of Dane, Sigtryggr, who manages to swoop in and do the impossible by taking over Winchester. And then throughout Season 4, we had this ongoing recurring theme of the young King Edward trying and frequently falling short of living up to the legacy of his father Alfred, who had this dream of a unified England, which we as the audience in 2020 are well aware of the fact that that dream is eventually successful. But it's absolutely fascinating watching all these warring kingdoms slowly but surely congeal into a unified culture, with frequent bloody battles between the Saxons and the Danes along the way. Now, there are a lot of major players this season, some of whom are familiar faces, some of whom are new faces, but obviously we have Uhtred and his loyal allies, Finan, Sihtric, and Osferth. And we have my biggest crush of the show, Ethelfled, who's still married to Ethelred at the beginning of the season. And one of the major parts of the first half of the season is how Ethelred is making a major push against East Anglia thanks to the advice of his hopeful mistress Edith, as well as her disreputable brother Eardwulf, who's trying to restore his family's reputation by basically turning himself into the most hated person in the British Isles. And obviously we have King Edward, who seems to spend most of the season trying to look tough, but he basically spends most of the season pouting and frowning and looking like he's about to cry like a newborn baby as he makes a series of blunders thanks to the advice of his ambitious father-in-law, Ethelhelm, as well as some additional bad advice from Edward's mother, Elswith, who's always plotting and scheming in one direction or another, and somehow she doesn't appear to be aging at all, in spite of now being a grandmother several times over. And of course, it wouldn't be a season of The Last Kingdom without a colorful cast of rampaging Danes, including Canute, Heston, Breda, and Sigtryggr. And the show's also doing a good job of introducing a next generation of characters, some youngins like Uhtred's son Uhtred. We also have Witgar, who's Uhtred's main rival for Bebbanburg. And a character that I'm really starting to like is Stiora, Uhtred's daughter, who's really eager to get out, live life, and get in touch with her pagan heritage and roots by spending a lot more time with the Danes. And while I don't think this show has a lot of overlap with Game of Thrones, the one area where I would agree that comparison is fair is that part of the fun of watching the show is that nobody's ever really safe. Because much like in Season 3, Season 4 gave us a ton of major character deaths. And because I'm so completely ignorant of the history of this period, I don't really know which major figures are going to stick around that long. The only thing I do know is that no matter how many times he's captured, no matter how many times he's tortured or defeated, Uhtred will always rise from the ashes stronger than ever. But speaking of some of these major deaths, they included Father Beocca, Canute, Uhtred's horrible uncle Elfric, as well as Lord Ethelred, which is a death that fans of the show will be celebrating for many years to come, because he was easily the character that I despised the most on the show, of course in a good way, because he stirs up additional drama just by acting like such a piece of shit all the time. And it appears as if at the end of Season 4, most likely Lady Elswith will be soon joining the ranks of the deceased, thanks to being betrayed and poisoned. But as much as I might like watching this show for all the various acts of treachery or savagery or just barbarism that we see in any given season, what really gets to me are the abundance of truly epic scenes, as well as a lot of heartwarming moments that in the end just make you feel really good while you're watching the show. I constantly find myself just laughing out loud or just having a big smile on my face just out of sheer joy at the events unfolding on the screen. I love seeing Uhtred slowly but surely bonding with his son over time and slowly earning his loyalty, to the point where his son, who's initially quite a skeptic due to his devout religious upbringing, he eventually comes around and vows to follow his father wherever he goes. Probably the biggest emotional peak for me the entire season is when Father Beocca throws himself in front of young Uhtred to take a crossbow bolt to the chest in order to save young Uhtred's life, which leads to a really cool series of flashbacks where Uhtred's remembering all of his experiences with Beocca over the previous 3 seasons, which is not something that we see very frequently in this show, but it's just a reminder of just how many crazy events that we've witnessed over the course of 4 seasons, as well as how many incredible experiences these 2 characters have shared. I was also really inspired by watching Ethelfled slowly but surely preparing for a battle, not really knowing if either her brother or her husband's armies would arrive in time, which opened the door to seeing this Welsh army in red kicking all kinds of ass against Canute, including a classic pit of spikes trap that Uhtred and his men dig out ahead of time. But the best part of that battle scene in episode 4 has to be Uhtred versus Canute in the forest. The choreography was absolutely incredible. But Uhtred has a ton of great hero moments on the battlefield and off. One of his big moments is when he abdicates the throne of Mercia in favor of Ethelfled, who he justifiably feels will be a much better fit on the throne, after having spent so much time in Mercia over the previous years. But obviously one of the big seismic changes that we see this season is when the Danes manage to slip in and capture Winchester when it's totally undefended. And it's funny, whenever I hear the name Winchester, it just makes me think of that pub in Shaun of the Dead where we see Simon Pegg on the phone and Nick Frost keeps looking at him going like, holding up the little W because he wants to go to the Winchester. But it leads to this giant epic 30-day siege of the city, with Edward making blunder after blunder, losing tons of men with these costly charges against the city walls. And then my favorite hero moment all season has to be when Uhtred offers to enter the city alone in exchange for Edward's 2 sons that are held captive. And we get this great shot where Uhtred's just walking up to the city walls. It almost looks like Captain America facing off against the armies of Thanos. And it was really interesting seeing Sigtryggr and Uhtred's interactions. They spar a little bit initially, but you can tell neither of them's taking it too seriously. They're just kind of feeling each other out. But they very quickly develop this rapport. And my prediction is that Sigtryggr is going to end up becoming Uhtred's son-in-law very early in the beginning of Season 5. But as much as I might enjoy these epic moments, or as much as I might enjoy these acts of heroism, what really entertains me is the constant bombardment of just truly grotesque scenes that remind us of just what a dark and barbaric and savage era this truly was. Early on, we get this great scene where we see these 2 corrupt monks go into a whorehouse, but rather than indulging in the typical vices in a whorehouse, instead, they just get whipped on their bare asses repeatedly out of some deranged way of atoning for the shame they feel for being in a whorehouse. But we also get a really savage scene where Witgar shoots his own father through the eye with a crossbow, which on one hand removes Uncle Elfric from Bebbanburg, clearing a path for Uhtred. On the other hand, Witgar has so many men in that fortress that right now he obviously has the strongest claim to that fort. So hopefully at some point we'll see Uhtred reclaim it. And of course, Ethelred is a constant source of amusement in terms of all the cruel things that he's always threatening to do to people, including his advisor Eardwulf, who he tells he's going to have publicly castrated for his many failures. But of course, Eardwulf finally gets his revenge when he straddles the wounded Ethelred and starts squeezing his head injury, essentially squeezing his brains out the back of his head. And then Eardwulf dies in his own painful, awful fashion when he gets executed by the Danes in a really painful way, where they basically take a sword and vertically shove it down through his neck and shoulder, and the camera pushes in for this really intense close-up where he's just gurgling in agony in his final death throes. And we get some pretty horrific scenes in Wales as well. At one point, a Welshman reports to the king's brother that Danes have attacked from Ireland, and he's just covered in lacerations, and his ear looks like it's been chewed up and mangled by a dog. And while the Welsh might have been depicted in a heroic fashion in the battle against Canute, we see that they're perfectly capable of their own savage moments, like when they're pissing on Brida down in a pit. But as always in this show, payback's a bitch. And in one scene, we see Brida attacking this village where she splits a chick's head in half in one of the goriest moments all season. And when it comes to sex and nudity, sadly this season was a little light on that front. We get a nice intimate moment between Uhtred and Ethelflaed early in the season, but really the only nude scene all season is when Uhtred's willing to be baptized. So we get a nice long lingering shot of his well-developed glutes. So I guess they threw that in for all the ladies out there, or fellas, depending upon what your thing. But in terms of flaws of the show, and once again, as I mentioned before, some of these flaws are part of the charm of the show because we see a lot of repetitive scenarios where the show seems to repeat itself. If Uhtred and Edward are getting along one episode where they're acting like they're going to be allies for life, in all likelihood, the very next episode we'll have a situation where Edward's having Uhtred locked up or beaten. And when you're binging the show, a lot of these repetitive scenarios become all the more glaring. But I guess the only times where I really call bullshit while I'm watching the show is when we see people in battle scenes who probably shouldn't be there. Like at the end of season 3, when we see Father Bayoka going into battle, it's like, sorry, you're like a skinny old man. This ain't going to go well. In this season, we have a couple moments like that with Ethelflaed. Now, Ethelflaed is one of my favorite characters in the show, but there's this one scene where a bunch of people with a battering ram are trying to knock down the gates of Winchester as flame and oil is being dropped down upon them, and we see her roaring in defiance right alongside all the fellas. And I'm like, sorry, you're the Queen of Mercia? I just call bullshit. It's a little bit like watching like a supermodel stroll out on a football field trying to play football alongside the NFL. But that is a very, very minor quibble on my part on what is otherwise an incredibly enjoyable show. And I would never argue that this show is up on the level of like a great historical epic that you would see on the big screen, something like David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia or Michael Mann's Last of the Mohicans. When it comes to historical epics, the bar has been set very high by some incredible movies over the years. But as a show that's just wildly enjoyable and addictive and fun, where you laugh and scream and high-five with yourself or somebody else, depending upon if you're watching alone or in a group, I'm 100% in The Last Kingdom's corner. And by the time this season got to the very last scene, where we're hearing Uhtred's voiceover narration, and we see that he's basically accepted a role as a mentor, raising and training Edward's bastard son Ethelstan, I just burst out laughing in joy when we hear Uhtred say, "Destiny is all." Actor Alexander Draymond, he's so invested in the character and he's so physically intimidating and he has so much personal charm that he manages to sell me on the show each and every single time he appears on screen. In any event, I think that's all I have to say about The Last Kingdom. At some point, I am just going to have to get off my butt and actually start reading some of these books. But for now, I'm happy just to sing the praises of what I think is a very entertaining show, and hopefully one that will run for many more years to come. But if you like this reaction and review, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. And if you have any more recommendations for books and or shows or movies on this front, definitely give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax or leave a comment in the comments below. But I can't thank you enough for watching the video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.